Gildan Media, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lean Leader, A Personal Journey of Transformation by Robert B. Camp, narrated by Stephen R. Thorne. Preface. Why listen to this book? Answer: without lean leaders, there can be no lean. If you want to be a lean organization, your leaders must lead using lean principles. For almost two-thirds of my career as a lean practitioner, I could never understand why most transformations failed. As I practiced, read, and wrote, the answer was gradually revealed. Lean isn't just about eliminating waste or saving money or even focusing on the customer. You can do those things all day long and never be lean. Lean is a way of leading. Put another way, until the top of an organization fully embraces lean, the rest of the organization can never be lean. It doesn't matter how much they spend on consultants, how many kaizens they conduct, what number of grandmaster, double shot, hold the foam, triple black belts they possess. That's all just noise. Without lean leaders, there can be no sustainable lean. My blog often tackles the nuts and bolts of leading a lean transformation, but my books continue to use the novel format for two reasons. The first is that the characters get to describe concepts in ways that cold definitions just can't. The novel gives the definitions context. The other reason for using novels is that most of us learn better from stories rather than textbooks. Both can convey the same information, but the novel puts flesh on the sterile words as the characters apply them to real conditions. This book is intended for executives. Not that others can't benefit from it, but the people who really need to lead lean are the folks at the top of organizations. Please, if you're an executive, don't let the novel format or the short length of this book put you off. It contains powerful insights found in few other places. The characters of The Lean Leader, A Personal Journey of Transformation, struggle in their jobs, just as you do. They face real crises and what seem to be unreasonable deadlines. Another thing to take into account, you can't lead a lean business in the same way as you would a non-lean one. You'll see what happens as Don, the central character of this story, grapples with that fact. As the story progresses, you'll watch Don and his subordinates all transform from what is known as command and control leaders, those who make decisions and bark orders, to a more Socratic method of leading. As they come to realize that the folks they employ are the real experts of their professions, Don's staff learns to do more asking than telling. They come to realize that their greatest skill needs to be coaching great performance from their people. They also learn the difference between managing and leading. It becomes apparent that they've spent their careers managing while calling it leadership. Slowly, Don and his staff change their behavior to become better leaders. To do that, they begin to shed the decision-making tasks that have cluttered their days. They learn instead to delegate those decisions to employees who are closer to the action. Making decisions closer to the source of the problem causes their organization to be more nimble, to respond to crises and market changes much faster. Then they learn to look over the horizon, to spend more time seeking to understand what the future of their industry and its technology hold, and how they can best position Friedman Electronics, their firm, to be better prepared for that future. In one of Don's most vulnerable moments, his boss tells him he's not doing his job unless he's building bench. At the time, Don doesn't even know what that means, but as the book concludes, he has begun the mastery of the skill. All in all, the lean leader turns out to be someone most of us would enjoy being. And what makes it even better, lean leaders create organizations that thrive socially as well as financially. I feel confident you'll enjoy listening to this book. Chapter 1. A Retrospective. Jim thumbed unseemingly through the airline magazine. 25 months ago, he'd accepted the VP of Operations position, and he hadn't been home much since. His wife, Bridget, had overseen the move from their old home into their new one with the efficiency of a NASA mission control manager. She'd also overseen the preparation of their two teens, Joyce and Jim Jr., for the move to their new high school. Jim, by contrast, had spent most of that time on an airplane visiting the plants now under his control. He marveled again at how he'd gotten this job. He'd actually been a plant manager before this and had been fired by his predecessor. Without his knowing, Jim's subordinates had staged an impressive campaign to win him favor with the board of directors, and shortly after he'd been let go, the board had let the old VP Ops go and rehired Jim into that position. You might ask why. The answer was that Jim had built a team of subordinates that acted with a near-perfect alignment with one another. They had also improved quality and on-time delivery while reducing cost to the point that they'd become the best operating plant in the Friedman Electronics Corporation. Of course, that's only part of the reason. The bigger part was that Jim had shown uncommonly good leadership. Because of that, his subordinates had given him their unwavering loyalty. As so often happens with good leaders, Jim had no idea how his employees felt about him until they came to his defense. Now, Jim always made a point to visit with his old management team whenever he visited the plant. After a rocky start under his successor, the team had resumed their trend of success. Oblivious to the fact that they'd been successful because of him, Jim continued to feel great pride in watching his old team succeed. He hadn't seen them coalescing around his leadership, but simply banding together to achieve a series of common goals. Although that, too, was true, it had been Jim who had led them to identify the goals in the first place, and Jim who had guided them through the process of achieving them step by painful step. That was Jim, quiet, humble, introspective, caring. This flight was taking Jim to visit the worst-performing plant in the chain. He was going there to meet Frank, the consultant who had helped him to become the best-performing plant manager in the Friedman organization. When he'd been promoted, Jim had rehired Frank to lead the rest of his plants through similar transformations. Some plants had embraced the new style easily, others fought it. Jim had already had to fire several plant managers, and he feared this trip would lead to the firing of yet another. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Chapter 2. Charleston. Don was a Southern gentleman. After a drink or two, he might remind you that it was by act of Congress, because he graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in the late 1960s, when graduating cadets were commissioned as both officers and gentlemen. But the truth was that Don exhibited, no, maybe exuded was the better word, Southern charm. Don, formerly Donald Benjamin Spears V, could trace his ancestry back to England. Like most Southern aristocrats, the bulk of his family wealth had long since been dissipated, and all Don owned were the family plantation home and the 40 acres on which it stood. As an only child, the house and property had come to him through inheritance. His income paid for its upkeep, and Don had learned from his parents that if you cared for something, it lasted much longer than if you didn't. So he took meticulous care of the house and leased the land to pay the taxes. Don's country club membership had come to him the same way as the property. His grandfather had been one of the early investors, and not only secured a lifetime membership, but ensured that it would be passed to his son and every heir thereafter. In short, in the town of Charleston, Don was a presence, what many would call a good old boy, or more derisively, a G.O.B. The same was true at Friedman's Charleston plant. Don had risen quickly to a senior management position, largely through patronage, but he'd held his own in each position. When the time came for Don to become plant manager, he had become one of the best in the entire Friedman organization. He'd held that distinction until recently, when, after 2 years of employing lean, his peers were starting to eclipse his performance. Don's management style had come to him in much the same way as his property and memberships, through inheritance. He'd grown up in a household with servants and the autocratic management style that working with servants required. Don had been led to believe that his authority was the result of good breeding and higher intelligence. As a result, he operated with total self-confidence that his dictates were the best for the organization. When Jim had assumed the role of VP Ops, he'd visited all the plants in the Friedman chain. He'd been to the Charleston plant during that tour, but at the time it had been operating above the norm. When he'd arrived this time, he'd asked Don to convene all of his direct reports. After his factory tour, Jim had requested a visit to Don's wall. During his tenure as a plant manager, Jim had been coached to create a single place where the plant's metrics were posted no less frequently than monthly. His team of direct reports had referred to this public spot as the wall, because it occupied a wall in the wide central corridor leading to the plant. The title had stuck. Now each plant had one. As Jim arrived at Don's wall, he noted immediately that there were only 4 graphs on the wall, and that the graphs only contained the current month's data. There was no board on which the charts were posted. They'd been unceremoniously taped to a wall without so much as a document protector. Jim formed an immediate impression, and it wasn't good. "Tell me about this," Jim asked one of Don's managers. The man stared at him blankly. Don immediately volunteered that this was the wall. Jim again turned to the manager he'd first addressed and, pointing to the chart labeled On-Time Delivery, asked the man to explain it. Again, the man stared at him, unsure of what to say. Jim turned to a second manager, but before he could ask the same question, Don pushed his way through the knot of managers and began to explain the charts. Jim courteously listened to Don's explanation of the first chart and then held up his hand to impede any further explanations. Pointing to a second chart, he asked another manager what it meant. The man immediately looked to Don, who started to offer the answer, but Jim again stopped him with a raised hand. "What does this chart mean?" Jim asked again. "I guess it's talking about quality," the man said. "Good," Jim replied. "What specifically is it telling us?" The man stammered, now looking to Don for help. As Don opened his mouth, Jim again raised his hand, never taking his eyes off the manager of whom he'd asked the question. "Go on," he encouraged. "Take a guess." "Well," the manager was now visibly perspiring, "I guess it's saying that we're doing pretty good." There were supportive smiles in the crowd. "Why do you say that?" asked Jim. "Well," the manager responded, feeling more confident, "because the point is over 90%. Jim nodded his head, encouraging the man. Then he turned to the group and said, "There are approximately 87,000 airline flights in the United States every day. If the airline industry operated at 90% defect-free maintenance, how many aircraft could we expect to fall out of the sky each day?" He waited for an answer. No one made eye contact with him. "Okay, I'll give you the answer. We would expect 10% failures, or as many as 8,700 airplanes to have serious problems. Some of those would fall out of the sky every day. If that were true, how many of you would fly anywhere?" His question was met with dead silence. Jim continued, "There are about 20 million surgeries requiring general anesthesia performed in this country each year. Anyone here had surgery in the last year? Any of you have a family member who had surgery in the last year?" 2 hands went up. If doctors operated at 90% defect-free, how many patients would die on the operating table? Jim waited. Silence. "So let's do the math. 20 million times 10%, the number of defective surgeries, would be how much?" A hand was raised near him. "Yes?" 2 million, replied the manager. "Good," Jim complimented him. Now, turning back to the 2 men who had family members with surgeries, Jim asked, "If there was a 1 in 10 chance that the physician could mess up your loved one, permanently disfigure them, leave them incapacitated, or even kill them, would either of you let your family member go under the knife for anything but life or death reasons?" Both men wagged their heads, no. "So," Jim continued, "how is the Charleston plant doing?" He let the question hang a second, then asked, "How many line items do you ship a month?" There was no answer. "Who is your production control manager?" he asked. A man raised his hand. "How many line items do you ship a month?" Jim asked again. The man looked confused and shot a glance at Don. Reasserting control of the situation, Don interjected. "Good conversation, Jim. What say we move it into the conference room where we can all sit down and chat?" With that, he moved his team away from the wall and Jim. "Not necessary," Jim stated. "How about just you and I meet in the conference room?" "Well," Don began, "if it's just the two of us, let's meet in my office." Jim could tell Don was trying to move on to more familiar terrain where he had the upper hand. Jim wanted to keep the upcoming conversation on neutral ground. "No thanks," he replied. "I'd prefer the conference room." Don, who was used to getting his way, gave the signal to his management team to go back to their jobs, and he led Jim to the conference room. Ever the Southern gentleman, Don immediately asked Jim if he'd like coffee or water. Jim declined, but Don gave an order for coffee to his secretary, who had materialized when they'd entered the room. Again, Don had demonstrated control over the situation, and Jim was tiring of it. Don now chit-chatted while they both waited for his secretary to arrive with a freshly brewed cup of coffee. When Don received his coffee and the secretary had departed, he tried to continue his earlier dialogue. Jim stopped him. "Don, I don't have a lot of time, and I need you to listen to what I have to say." Don stared back with a level gaze. In a jovial tone totally unbefitting the moment, he said, "Okay, boss, shoot." "Don, for better than a decade you've run this plant and have had great results. I congratulate you. However, change is constant, and your progress has not been. Now you have colleagues who exceed your performance on every metric, and that is concerning me. I look at your wall and know it was hastily assembled, with little plan to continue it after my visit ends. That won't do. I look at your management team and realize that not one of them is prepared to replace you if you had a medical emergency. I look at the faces of your management team, and every one of them is male. That may have been acceptable in 1980, but this is a new era. The population in Charleston is over 50% female. I also note that you only have one person of color on your staff, despite the fact that demographics indicate that the African American population in Charleston is almost 30%, and that there is a growing Latino population. Don, you'll note, I'm talking with facts, and that's exactly what I expect my plant managers and their staffs to do. I want facts. I want graphs. I want goals set and improvements made. Starting next week, I want you to begin emailing me your weekly graphs for this plant's safety, quality, on-time delivery, cost, and sales data. I want to see a plan each week that tells me what problems are inhibiting you from achieving each of these, what the root causes of those problems were ascertained to be, what action you intend to take, who you are holding accountable for the improvement, and what completion deadline you've given them. Jim noticed that Don wasn't taking notes, nor did he have a pen or paper. Do you have a photographic memory? Jim asked. No, sir. Then go get a pen and paper. I'm dead serious about what I'm asking for and about how I want it. I'll wait. When Don returned, Jim repeated what he'd told him and then went on to say, Don, that's just the start, and let me be blunt. You're now 2 years behind your peers. For 2 years you haven't taken me seriously, and that tells me a great deal about our relationship. It says you don't respect me, and that is not a good message for me to get. So, I'm putting you on short-term suspension. By that, I mean you have 90 days to get with the program. If you do, you keep your job. If you don't, I'm sure I don't have to tell you what you can expect. Don's face had grown scarlet, but he kept silent. Jim pressed on. Now, Don, I'm going to make every resource in the corporation available to you, but I'm holding you accountable for figuring out what you'll need and for asking for it. Ask me directly. That's how I'll know if you're even making an attempt. Do you have any questions of me? Jim concluded. Don had kept his gaze on Jim throughout the monologue. He cleared his throat and after a second said, No, sir. All right, Don. I hear that you're a hell of a guy, and it would disappoint me to no end if you didn't rise to this challenge. I believe that you've got the makings of a great leader, but you're a long way from there right now. In fact, I give you less than a 50-50 chance of surviving past a year." He stopped to let his statement take its full effect. "Don, I want you to know that I'm pulling for you and will do everything in my power to help." Jim stopped. "Do you believe me?" he asked. Don didn't answer for long seconds. Jim waited. "In truth, sir? No, I don't." "Why's that?" Jim asked. "Well, sir, I think you've already made up your mind to replace me. I believe you're just waiting for me to fail." "Don, thank you for the courtesy of an honest answer. I admire that more than you know. If you and I are to make it as a management team, we need to have a relationship of trust built on honesty. So I am glad that you didn't hesitate to give me your honest assessment. Let me issue another challenge. Test me. Ask me for the resources you believe you'll need to improve your operation and see if you get them. If you ask and I don't deliver, then you have your answer. If you ask and I do deliver, then I want you to ask for help again and again until you can accept that I want you to succeed. Deal?" Don stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Yes, sir." "Are you ready to ask for anything today?" Again, Don paused. "No, sir." Then he went on. "Let me give it some thought and get back to you." "Deal," said Jim. Jim rose, extended his hand, and thanked Don for his hospitality. "You've got my number," he said. "Call me directly." And with that, he left the building and headed back to the airport. Chapter 3. At Home. Don's marriage to Huntington Esther Porter had taken place at West Point. Exiting the Gothic cadet chapel through a gauntlet of crossed sabers, the pair had begun life as a military couple. Honey, as she was known to her friends, understood her role as an officer's wife. Cotillion life had prepared her for white-gloved teas and receiving lines. When it came to being an officer's wife, Honey represented Don as well as any could have asked. Honey formed quick friendships with the wives of other officers. When Don's first assignment stationed them abroad, Honey often organized expeditions, as she liked to call them, into fun spots around their assignments. These expeditions became so popular that the wives of more senior officers often joined them. The bubbly Honey never failed to treat these women with respect, and soon won their abiding loyalty. She didn't pander to them, and was unafraid to be herself. The young Mrs. Spear's goodwill often found Don being invited to social gatherings with officers 2 and 3 pay grades above his own. No dummy himself, Don cultivated these relationships. Having an income from his family trust afforded Don the ability to invite his senior officers on hunting and fishing trips that his peers couldn't afford. Having grown up accompanying his own father on such excursions, this was a milieu in which Don felt comfortable. He didn't ask for anything from his senior officers. His parents had taught him that if you treat people right and you do your job well, human nature will see to it that opportunities come your way. Don did his job well, and, sure enough, opportunities had come his way. Ever the gentleman, Don always expressed gratitude for these opportunities and never behaved as if he felt entitled to them, even though the truth was that he did everything necessary to earn them. From all outward appearances, Don and Honey were a perfect match, and in many ways they actually were. They'd been friends in high school. Their peers just assumed that they were a meant-to-be couple, and without really intending to, they just fell into an easy dating relationship. Their marriage wasn't without love, but it was far more sedate than those of others they knew. Theirs was more mutual admiration and affection. Sure, there was passion, but the core of their relationship was a shared belief that they would dominate any field in which they chose to participate. In large measure, that became a reality. Chapter 4. First Request. Jim had gotten back home after midnight Saturday morning. He was exhausted and crawled into bed beside his sleeping wife. His visit to the Charleston facility had left him frustrated and a bit angry. His first year, he had followed Jim Collins' advice to concentrate on first who, then what. Jim Collins had written a highly revered book itemizing the practices that organizations exhibited when transforming themselves from being merely good to being industry-leading. The book's title was true to form, Good to Great. It had become an oft-referenced handbook throughout Friedman Electronics. Besides, he knew he was being watched and that his honeymoon period would be gone in a flash. He had replaced those plant managers who had not gotten on board. It was easy to pick them out because their numbers never improved, and they refused to adopt the new behaviors required of leaders using lean. Those were tense and nerve-wracking days when everyone expected him to turn all the manufacturing plants around in short order, as he had his own plant. The difference had been that he knew who worked for him when he ran his own plant. As corporate VP of operations, he knew his new subordinates only as former peers. Now, he had to get to know them much better. He'd sent Frank, his now full-time consultant, to visit every plant and to work with plant managers to get them all using some of the tools of lean. Frank had worked with the plant managers and their staffs. Meanwhile, Jim had met with the plant managers as a group and for one-on-one coaching sessions. A handful of the plant managers adapted quickly. They were soon off and running, needing little assistance. The balance of plant managers fell into two groups. One struggled hard to become what Jim required of them. The others just left or actively resisted. The latter were quickly let go. As Jim continued to develop the plant managers, Frank then worked on their Directors of Continuous Improvement, CI, a new position that Jim had required each of the plant managers to create. One by one, Frank had conducted Kaizen events in each of the facilities, first demonstrating how to run a Kaizen event, then holding the new CI directors responsible for conducting them with his coaching. The CI directors received lots of training and practical application in the use of all the lean tools and philosophies, but that wasn't enough to keep a lean initiative alive. Breathing life into an initiative would take top-down leadership, and that was the phase of his mission that Jim was now undertaking. As with CI directors, leadership behavior had to be demonstrated at the plant manager and staff level. For that reason, Jim was present at each of the plant's kickoff Kaizen and set the example that his plant managers should do the same. Jim was back on the last day of each Kaizen event he'd kicked off to hear the final reports of the Kaizen teams and to encourage them to continue on the path to continuous improvement. It had been a grueling schedule, and Jim had gotten the flu several times his first year, but he never let that affect his presence. What frustrated him about his trip to Charleston was that Don's performance had been good enough from the beginning, and so it had never caused Jim to scrutinize it. Now, he felt stupid for having missed the fact that Don had been a highly functioning, passive resistor. It wasn't just that he'd missed the fact that Don's metrics, although better than his peers, had never changed. It was more the fact that he'd let 2 years drift by, while Don continued to exhibit the same old bad behaviors to his staff. The way Don had achieved his good numbers was totally dependent on his autocratic style of management. Jim had learned long ago that results attained that way were unsustainable. Those were his thoughts as he drifted off to sleep that Saturday morning. What worried Jim the most was the fact that he was almost certainly going to have to fire Don. Whether Don made it or not, Jim faced a long rebuilding process in the Charleston plant. The mere thought was draining. Monday arrived along with a frontal system that dumped buckets of rain. Jim had planned a week in the office to catch up on paperwork. He was well into it when his phone rang around 9 a.m. "Jim, this is Don Spears. Is this a good time to talk?" Jim stopped what he was doing and refocused his thoughts. "Yes, Don. How's the weather down there?" "Muggy," came the reply. "Just the way we like it." There was a trace of humor in Don's voice for a second, but it was quickly replaced with a more serious tone. "If I accept your offer of help, what can I expect?" "Good start," Jim complimented him. "That depends on what you're going to ask for. Let's review the immediate problems I found with your organization. Your wall, or lack thereof, your shallow management bench, the ethnic and gender composition of your leadership team, the fact that you've blown me off for 2 years, the fact that you employ a dictatorial management style. With which of those do you need help?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?